I would like the city manager is going to give us a presentation now for a few minutes on what the budget is involved with.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Can everyone hear me okay? We'll start out tonight by just quickly giving a cursory view of the proposed budget you have before you. The general fund revenues are relatively stagnant year over year. Property taxes are slightly down. Income tax, we project a slight increase. We are monitoring the economy, GDP, to see how our economic indicators look because that does greatly affect our income tax. But for all intents and purposes, it's a very stagnant revenue for the general fund, incredibly stagnant. Moving down to the general fund expenditures, year over year, slightly under $1 million increased. In large part, it is because of the rising fringe cost of our health care premiums, of our unfunded liabilities for pension and health care costs, and also a 2% raise, which we're contractually obligated for all employees that goes into effect July 1st. So all employees will receive a 2% raise this year coming July 1st. The capital improvements, we're reappropriating the $300,000 for the elevator project that was in this current year because the work won't begin until September because there's a long lead time on the parts. So those expenditures will be incurred in the next fiscal year. We have reinstated $55,000 in capital for McMorran. We also continue to assess every position when retirees take place to see if that position needs to be replaced or if we can contract out. And we will continue to do that in this current budget. In the rubbish and garbage collection, as you all know, in 08 and 09, during the housing market, our property tax values tanked, leading to about a $230,000 structural deficit within the rubbish fund. And our cash reserves, which were at high at $1.5 million in 2008, would be depleted by the end of the year. Without additional revenue, just like last year, bulk leaf and yard waste pickup and recycling would need to be eliminated. In this current budget, we continue the $25 annual fee per residential dwelling to be charged in order to maintain the bulk leaf pickup, but also recycling throughout our community, just as in last year.
Okay, so this is just a continuation.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, no increase. Other highlights, as you all know, we had a HUD loan repaid for $1.1 million. We've set aside $350,000 for housing improvements to fund Pioneer Home Buying Program and other programs within our Community Development Office. But we've also allotted $750,000 to be used for reconstruction of downtown parking lots. A contract was recently awarded for $436,000 for the complete reconstruction of East Quay parking lot. We believe that we will have some additional funds left over that we can look at maybe some additional parking lots in the coming year as well. A contribution from the DDA of $100,000 is in their proposed budget to help with street paving on Glenwood and the Beard Street area, the project that's going on up here on Michigan and Beards area in this coming summer. For the second consecutive year, the proposed budget includes an additional $500,000 down payment on our more than $100 million of unfunded liabilities, thereby improving our funding levels over time. Most other programs have been maintained at current levels. The proposed budget includes projections for 18 and 19 as well. As part of the commitment I made when I became your city manager was to maintain 3-year rolling budget projections, and you have that in this budget. MERS has been conducting an experience study to determine what changes need to be made in our actuarial assumptions in order to adequately fund our pensions and OPEBs that the City of Port Huron has for current employees and retirees. What this study is essentially looking at is, one, mortality tables. People are living long. The current mortality tables we use for our actuarial study is outdated. The other component of the experience study is a more realistic return on investment. Currently, we projected about 8% annual return on our investments. They are lowering that forecast to 7.75%. In addition to those two components of their experience study, they're also requiring that we reduce our fixed amortization periods of gains and losses and unfunded amounts. Since 2005, MERS has been gradually reducing our amortization period to help ensure that the cost of current employees is not shifted onto the future generations. Here's the concern. We have not seen that experience study. We will receive it this summer. And it could have profound impacts on budgets going forward. So we simply, our current actuary, our $100 million of unfunded liabilities, about $47 million of unfunded liabilities in the OPEBs, and about $53 million of unfunded liabilities in the pensions, those are based on outdated information. And we will get current information this coming summer.
So is this a global initiative on behalf of MERS?
Yes.
Because everyone else is dealing with the same issue?
Absolutely.
And, okay, a lot of complaints. And so
Absolutely. This will be the same experience study that all municipalities who use MERS will use.
Right, okay, thank you.
I wanted to give you a chart from 2009 of our pension fund and then our pension and OPEB so you can see the consistent growth in these two funds. And what's significant is we are still seeing consistent growth, and that's on outdated information that had a little bit unrealistic return on investment projections and outdated mortality tables and an amortization schedule which is a little bit longer. So this could get worse in the future. Moving on to the next slide, I think what exasperates the problem is we have had declining general fund revenue since 2009, and you'll see that. But I also put up there the required annual contributions for our unfunded liabilities. And this is what's important because when we talk about unfunded liabilities, sometimes it's hard to point to how does this affect our day-to-day lives of our citizens. And this is exactly how it does it. The more we have to pay for our unfunded liabilities is less general fund resources we have to pay for parks and recreation, police protection, fire protection, and general government. And so this graph further demonstrates the real day-to-day pressure our unfunded liabilities are placing on our ability to deliver services to our citizens.
Okay, and just benchmark right there. And under other highlights, you mentioned, the 100 million towards the unfunded liability. So what does that do to kind of counter this?
That's keeping it in, that's stifling the growth of it just a little bit.
Okay, so that's just like a Band-Aid.
Correct.
Okay.
With us tonight, we have Joe Heffron. He is a CPA and a partner for governmental practice and professional standards at Plant Moran. Plant Moran is one of the largest CPA firms in the country, or in the state, excuse me, and they work with almost hundreds of municipalities across the state. And so he's going to come and dissect our annual contributions for us.
Thank you. One of the things that you all remember in the June 30th, 2015 financial statements when you received them in December is that there was a new accounting pronouncement on how all cities within the United States will account for pensions, called GASB 68. And it put the liability for that right on the balance sheet. But one of the other things it did is it required the actuary to present a schedule of how the total pension liability changed from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. That gave us good information we had never had before that we could present to you. And so I took those numbers, and on the left half of the slide that I've got up here, I've cherry-picked the numbers from those changes in total pension liability so that I can measure what is the actual normal cost for pensions. And as you look at this, the service credits, that would be everybody provides service every year, and that added $1.78 million during the year ended June 30, 2015 to the cost of providing pensions. There was also administrative costs through MERS of $188,000, and the employees were contributing $1.15 million. Those three things are $823,000, and in a perfect world where the actuaries, every year that we had ever had an actuarial evaluation, if every estimate had been spot on, and people retired exactly when we thought, and they passed away exactly what the mortality table said, and we earned exactly what the 8, or at the time 8.25% rate of return was. If everything had been exact, and the actuary has to guess at all these things. I'm not being critical of any actuary, but if that had happened, that would have been our cost, $823,000. That's the cost of providing pensions for the year ended June 30, 2015. But none of the actuaries, not Gabriel Roeder, not Tegrit, none of the actuaries over the last 40 years have been guessing perfectly because they were basing it on what had happened in previous years, and that's the reason they do experience studies. Lots of things are happening differently. People are retiring a little earlier. They are living a lot longer. And the mortality tables that had been used were 1994. They've now updated it to 2014. So MERS is clearly getting better information. But the result of all those experience differences is that we started off the year with the $51 million net pension liability as of the beginning of last year. And when you look at the carrying cost of that, not even trying to eat into that and make that go away, just the carrying cost, the interest on that is $4.1 million. Plus, there was another $300,000, and it's a small number, but that's Ed's accounting stuff, all the experience differences that happen during the year, you amortize that to smooth it out. And so the long-run cost, the full accrual cost that was shown in your financial statements was $5.3 million for the year. That's the expense that had you paid that, the liability would not have grown, it would have stayed exactly the same. And that number is going to change a little bit from year to year, but if you keep paying essentially that number with inflationary increases, the $52 million at the beginning of the year would have just stayed right there. It didn't, it grew to $54 million because the contribution, the last line we have here, that the actuaries required you to pay was not $5.3 million, but $3.2 million. And so we knew when we presented this with the audit at the end of last year that there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And so those two bars, the one on the left is what the actuarial valuation with all their studies and assumptions said the city of Port Huron needs to pay $3.2 million. But the actual long-run cost to tread water and stay right where we were would have been $5.3 million.
So Joe, just a comment. Essentially, our pension fund took a $2.1 million hit last year.
Yes. And so the net pension liability from the beginning to the end of the year grew from about $52 million to about $54 million. This next slide is a history going back to the year 2000 of what the assets and the pension liability was. Now, the pension liability that's measured by the actuary is going to grow for a couple of reasons. At any point in time, at June 30, or actually it's December 31st, MERS is on a calendar year end, and so you have to shift everything 6 months. But at December 31st, 2014, 2015, when they're measuring the total pension liability, they're only counting the portion of the pensions that have been earned by providing employment services up through that measurement date of December 31, 2014, or the one we'll be getting in the summer will be December 31, 2015. We know that people will continue to work, earn more money, earn more service credits. The number of years that will get multiplied by the multiplier are all going to grow, but the cost of the new service, the new employment that's going to continue, the higher wages, that cost is not being recognized yet. So for that reason, we'd expect that number to grow from year to year. And you'd also expect it to grow with the 8% discount rate that they've been using. So when someone says, and I only point this out because I know a lot of communities have looked at the liability and said, okay, that's my hard number, let's deal with it and get rid of it. It's not a hard number because that's only the measurement through a point in time. It's going to continue to grow because as people provide more service credits, more employment, and interest goes up, it's going to continue to rise. So the blue line is in fact the liability that's been measured by the actuaries from 2000 all the way up through 2014. And we can see it did, as I would have guessed, it was rising. The asset side of it did not. We were 100% funded back in the year 2000 and 2001, as you can see. But the assets, in fact, stagnated and started to drop a little bit, and that's for a couple of reasons. We know that in 2008 and 9 we had market declines. The value of that that's shown up here is smoothed over 10 years, though. And so that's only coming in slowly over a 10-year period. One or two of the other years since then, we've had some higher than expected returns. Those are also being smoothed. All of the assets are being smoothed, which means returns above or below the 8.25% are being smoothed over 10 years. But also, I think the payouts are higher than MERS would have expected back in the year 2000 because of the mortality tables. People really are living longer, which is a great thing, but it means they're going to continue to take the pensions longer than what was originally assumed. And it's those reasons that have caused the orange line to be declining so that we're now about 61% funded instead of 100% funded.
So Joe, if I could, Madam Mayor and Council, you see here that our liabilities are growing consistently. Our assets are shrinking, $2.1 million in the pension fund alone last year. But this is based, again, on an old experience study by MERS with old mortality tables, old interest rate return numbers, in a longer horizon of the amortization schedule. And so this summer, we're going to get the new numbers, which all expectations are we'll make these projections worse. So this is the good numbers. This number should get worse by the end of summer when we get the new experience study applied to our actuaries.
So it doesn't mean anything, so it means we still got a job to do in trying to equalize this out. So my question is that when we, 2000, if we saw this trend, this was what this is, this trend, so it's like you say your guess, it's no guess because that's where it was going, as far as your liabilities. So seeing this, was there anything we could have done better to?
I think we'll skip to the end. We'll talk about that in
Okay,
a few
I
more
don't want
slides.
to jump
Yeah.
ahead. Okay, you're going to get that? Oh, okay, because I'm just trying to make sense of things. Okay.
Right. And then the third slide I have, and it's the last one. In the 2014 actuarial valuation, MERS is trying to get ahead of this issue a little bit. And this is not specific to the city of Port Huron.
Oh, right, yeah.
That doesn't make you feel much better, but this is what's happened nationally, quite honestly. So MERS is trying to get ahead, and so they were putting some projections, which they've not done prior to 2014, of what they see coming up in the future. And so you can see the actuarial required contribution. Now, the liability grew relatively quickly, but the way actuarially required contributions work is they amortize that difference, and that's the amortization period that had been 30 years down to 25, and now they're going to bring it down ultimately to a closed amortization period where everything will start with, I think 15 years is what they're going to ultimately get to, and each year's layer will go from 15 down to 0. And so it will be a much quicker payout ultimately, but the goal of an actuary in setting the contribution rates is to get us to 100% funded, but not to have rates jumping up and down. So they will smooth it in. I saw for one of my other cities where they did have a meeting a month ago because they were so anxious about what is it really going to do. Because when we were just eyeballing those three changes, we were thinking 30%, 40% increase, and fearful that this would be a problem much sooner to the general fund. The higher contribution rates will impact the general fund by the need to make that contribution, but they have tried to, for the one community that I saw them make a public presentation, and so I have to assume for all communities, while it was large increases, it was not a one-time jump of 30 or 40% that then rose by inflation. It was smoothed in. So this will represent a significant impact to the general fund. That's the bad news. The good news is it won't be immediately the year beginning July 1, 2017, because that's when this hits. July 1 of 17 would be the, quote, new contribution rates under those three changes. It won't be a one-time increase of 40% forever. It will be smoothed in a little bit. That's some good news. What I think this tells us, fitting it into your budgeting, is that you've done a great job of managing that fund balance, keeping it at 20 or 21% through the stagnation, really, of your revenue increases. This represents not blowing a hole in it, but it represents, boy, for the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's going to rise. It's going to take a few years to do that, but it will be a significant increase when we get out 10 years from now, certainly. And so it's a matter of understanding that now and dealing with what will that mean to how we provide benefits and still do everything else we've been doing with our city services.
To be very candid, our current, we no longer have the ability to pay our current commitments and maintain our current level of services to the citizens. And that problem is going to get worse moving forward because we are currently not decreasing our unfunded liabilities. It is still growing, even with our $500,000 of additional payment. And so that is the concern moving forward because of the growing annual contributions, about 60 to 63% of those costs are incurred in the general fund. So our fringe costs are stratified out between all the different operating expenses, the streets, the utilities, and the general fund. And about 63% of those costs are bared in the general fund. We dealt with this issue last year, but that didn't solve the problem. That bought us a year or so. So we're buying months and years. And so there will be larger changes. Moving forward, the magnitude of the changes that we expect from MERS, we simply don't know. And so it necessitated that we prepare a budget without major structural changes until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Once we receive our MERS actuarial study, we will spend 3 to 6 months working with our finance team, working with Plant Moran to develop options to bring to the mayor and council to slow or reduce the growing cost of legacy cost. And our goal will be to determine steps needed to present a budget in 17 and 18 which reduces or eliminates the reliance on operating transfers. Because the budget you have before you relies on $635,000 of land purchase fund transfer to balance, as well as $333,000 for capital improvements. And so we had to use some land purchase fund to maintain this budget until we get essentially define the beast we're dealing with when we get our new experience study. And so that's a quick overview of what we're dealing with, the budget you have before you. I'm available, and Joe is available as well if you have any questions. And we can talk about this at the budget work session coming up as well.
Okay, so we can't really have really a legitimate discussion until you do come back with a strategy and some options as to how we're going to move forth and counter some of this in order to get it stable, to see what we can do.
I think we owe it to our employees and their families to make sure we make decisions that are long-term fixes.
Yeah, precisely,
And you're correct. Until we define the problem,
Right.
get the study in, know the numbers firm, we shouldn't make short-term decisions based on short-term results. We really need to be taking a longer look and a longer horizon on the impacts of the decisions we're making. And so you are correct. Waiting until we have that study is what we're hoping for.
Absolutely. Thank you. A nice presentation. Thank you, too.
All right, is there anyone else who would like to?
Yeah, I got a
Councilmember
question
Harris?
for, I guess, Mr. Hefferman. He made a really kind of convincing comment that, retiring early has created part of this catastrophe that's coming up. Does that necessarily mean that we'll have to raise the bar on our retirees to make it a little higher?
I've had those discussions with a few communities, and that's hard to do, particularly public safety, because you've got operational concerns. I'm 59 years old. I don't know that you want me out there fighting a fire for you anymore. 10 years ago, maybe. But I'm sure, and it's different with office workers. It's a different consideration.
Right,
But with a lot of the things that your employees are doing, you really have to think through we've got to be safe for them, and so that's harder to do. It absolutely is. There's about 6 different strategies that MERS is going to try to present to everybody with these new actuarial valuations. That's one of them, but they also understand, particularly with public safety, you can't say everyone works to 65. That doesn't work.
Yeah,
They're looking at the measurement of pensionable wages. Should we be looking at currently, most communities, all salaries and wages? Well, what if we didn't include the sick and vacation payouts? What if we didn't include overtime? That can help tremendously smooth things out. Looking at cost of living, which is very important, and that's another one where cost of living is a significant driver of the future costs. It's also very important to the employees. If you gave me a choice of having cost of living, no cost of living, versus I can have it but start at a lower base, I'd say start me at a lower base. Because, so there's, as I said, 6 different elements that they're really talking to communities about. Why don't you consider some of these things? And it's a complex ball of all these things, all these levers you can pull in terms of what defines the benefit has a significant impact on the cost, and you want to have the right balance of being able to have a benefit you can afford, but also doing right by the employees. I understand that.
Councilman Harris, if I could add to that, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing we're going to do to fix this. This is going to be moving many levers to looking at the long-term impacts. But one of the reasons why I highlight this, and I've highlighted this since the day I've got here, is I believe that we have a moral and ethical obligation to our employees and to our retirees and to the future citizens of this community to begin talking about this problem. And the city of Port Huron has been on the forefront of defining this problem, of talking about this issue, where now other communities are now taking our lead across the state and calling up Joe and asking for numbers on these. And so I applaud us in all of you for the efforts we've made in the last 24 months to begin really having a serious conversation about this. Because to be completely candid, this is the greatest threat facing our community. It will challenge our ability to provide services to our citizens, and it will challenge our ability to provide our commitments to our current employees and to our retirees.
Any other questions from anyone on council? I mean, I'm sure, thank you for the presentation, and
Glad to help.
I'm sure we'll be hearing, anxiously awaiting for what the solutions are, 6-8 months from now after you get the study and have time to look at it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freed.